I saw a lot of criticism about the book from the audiences, the readers on Goodreads, yeah, and some of the psychiatrists that say like Jon Ronson, he's no expert in this field. Yeah, and why does he write a book about psychopathy, something that he has no clue about?
The Psychopath Handbook, basically, despite its rather textbook or clinical title, it's really just a story about him talking to supposed psychopaths and the various people who are involved in psychopath research.
All right, hello and welcome everyone to be back on our podcast, The Sun, the Stars of Books Lovers United. And this is episode 1. Wow, congratulations. Well, okay, so this is the podcast for any of you guys right here when we discuss with our guests to get their insights towards a particular book. Specifically, today we're going to talk about the Psychopath Test and a little bit about psychology. And please welcome our guest for today, Ming. Hi, Ming.
Hello, Khang. Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
All right. Well, okay. The book and psychology. You're studying psychology, right? So can you give the audience like which year, which program are you in right now?
Yes, I'm in the Bachelor of Science program for psychology at Sunway. Currently in my just started my second year, but finishing my first semester for that.
All right. So, okay, since you are studying psychology, and the book is basically about psychopathy, and they talk about a lot of psychopaths, a lot of psychological problems, mental health. How much do you feel related to the book?
So strangely enough, you don't really study psychopaths in first year or second year psychology, as far as I know. So maybe nothing that I can relate to from actual formal knowledge, but definitely I have an interest, I think, in this topic. So the topic of psychopaths is very fascinating and opens up into quite a unusual, rather strange world, really. And this book, I think, goes into that quite well.
All right, I see. Okay, so for someone who hasn't read the book yet, can you give them just like short summary of the book? What's the book about? Who's Jon Ronson? And do you read any of his famous work? Because I know, like, his big hit is like what's the name of that? I forgot it. Another book that he published before this one, right? It became like a hit.
Yeah, that was the Men Who Stare at Goats, which was also made into loosely adapted into a film.
Oh, all right. Yeah. So yeah, just a summary of the book.
So yeah, the Psychopath Handbook, basically, despite its rather textbook or clinical title, it's really just a story about him talking to supposed psychopaths and the various people who are involved in psychopath research, usually from the forensic or criminal perspective, and his own journey, I guess, through what he calls the madness industry, which he terms that his work as a journalist, where he goes around interviewing people and finding people who are just crazy enough to make an interesting story, a good narrative, and his journey in discovering this aspect about himself, I guess.
Yeah, I saw a lot of criticism about the book from the audiences, the readers on Goodreads, yeah, and some of the psychiatrists that say like Jon Ronson, he's no expert in this field. Yeah, and why does he write a book about psychopathy, something that he has no clue about?
Well, I mean, he's a journalist, so he's going to, again, like he even talks about this in the book, that his job as a journalist is to find interesting stories, interesting people to talk to, and to write it in a way that can maybe educate, but also to entertain the audiences. So why does he pick this topic? I mean, to be fair, like, we are very fascinated by psychopaths, aren't we, in society? You just look at the media and you look at films or books, and we find the idea of psychopaths perhaps disturbing, but in a way that you can't quite look away from this idea that some people just simply are capable of doing terrible things because of something going on with their head. So it makes a good story. I think that's the only reason why that he would write a book like this, is that it just simply makes a good story that people would want to read.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly what how I felt reading the book. Like I think like some of the criticisms those are a little bit harsh towards him. Yeah, it's just like a book like I don't want to say that, but it's more like when you read the news, right? And it's like a collection of the news, like the story when he explodes the industry, not really industry, but the topic of psychopathy. That he goes from the one who does not know anything about it, and he got interest in because of a guy named Tony. Okay, that's a fake name, by the way. That he just faked all the way to go to. It's like a center for a psychopath, even though he's not a psychopath, right? So I feel fascinated by the book. I finished that in just like 2 days.
Yeah.
Not gonna lie, it's so good, so well written, and he just like mentions a lot of psychopaths in the book, and I kid you not, I look up almost every single person in the book that he
Really,
mentioned.
all the criminals and all the
Yeah, and honestly, I also looked up a lot of interviews of the psychopaths, and I have been frightened by that, honestly.
Yeah, I didn't look up all of them. I wasn't that dedicated, apparently. I did look up Peter Woodcock, who was mentioned quite a bit because he was quite an infamous psychopath and criminal in Canada back in the day. So, yeah, the interviews with him, though, that he gave about the crimes that he committed. Yeah, it's hard to describe. It's disturbing, yes, but also in a way that it piques your curiosity, I think, about
Yeah.
such people.
Yeah, I mean, it also explained in the book that some people they are born being like a psychopath, incurable. So, in your opinion, perspective about someone who studies psychology, do you think it's true?
So I don't know enough to be able to say in an educated way whether that's true or not.
But that's like a human being. Like, do you believe that? Because like in Vietnam, like we have a code. Like if someone who is born, right, they are born with a kind heart. So deep down there is some goodness in them. So I don't know whether that is true. And this would change my mind completely. Like they say, okay, someone who's born psychopath and they cannot be cured. No matter what you do.
I think it's possible. I think it's definitely possible. The idea that there could be something physically different about your brain, and that leads to you not being able to feel empathy, which is what psychopaths are generally said to. They don't feel empathy, and causes differences in behavior. I think that's definitely possible. Whether that's actually true is another matter altogether. The guy who developed the psychopath test that is mentioned in this, that's talked about in this book, that's central to this book actually, he certainly believes, for instance, that there is something fundamentally different about the brains of psychopaths. And in fact, he thinks that to such a strong degree that there was another person, I think Professor Anthony Maiden, who is in fact the clinician in charge of Tony at Broadmoor.
Yeah.
And he was somewhat critical of this man, Dr. Robert Hare, who invented the list. And he said that Dr. Robert Hare spoke about psychopaths like they were a different species, like that they were so radically different from, I guess, normal people that he didn't even seem to think of them as human, I guess. Although maybe Robert Hare might think that was an exaggeration of his words, but who knows?
Yeah, agree. Okay, so that's enough for psychology. Let's talk about the book, right? What is your favorite story or character or event in the book? Yeah, that stood out to you.
So there was a lot of there were a lot of candidates for my favorite moments in the books. Mostly, I quite liked the parts where Jon Ronson was interviewing all of these people, like Toto Constance, the former Haitian death squad leader, or I believe his name was Al.
And he was so confident and like so brave to, I don't know, like, knowing that those people could be psychopaths and they just like walk into their house and say, "You are a psychopath. I don't believe that you are not a psychopath."
Yeah, that does take a lot of confidence. Like even when he goes to interview Al Dunlap, in his mansion, and basically sits down and says that, "Oh, I have a list here that says that you might be a psychopath," to the guy, while his bodyguard and his wife is sitting next to him.
That's so strange to me. Like, oh my god, like, yeah, I would be freaked out.
Yes, I think most people would, actually.
Oh, so you like the journey that he interviews them?
I do like the interview just simply because the people that he interviews are kind of larger than life. They seem almost maybe it's the way that he writes about them. So maybe that's giving the a rather biased impression. But they sometimes seem like less like real people and more like characters in something.
That's true. I mean, like, well, they are real people.
Yeah.
They're real people. Just Tony is a made-up name because he's released, and like John mentioned in the book that he doesn't really want to trouble him in the
Yes, exactly,
word
yeah.
industry. But for the rest of them, they are real people, I believe. What's the favorite event in the book? Like the past event, the events that he mentioned. He mentioned a lot of events, right? Oak Ridge, and then the Truth Movement, and a lot of things. So
Oak Ridge definitely for me,
okay.
just because of how, again, strange and bizarre it is, and yet it actually happened.
Oh,
Like-
can you give the audience like what's this Oak Ridge?
Oh
and-
boy!
Yeah,
So
what happened?
The Oak Ridge experiments, which became the Oak Ridge scandal later
Right.
on. So it starts with a man by the name of Dr. Elliot Barker, who in the 1960s was a psychiatrist in Canada and came up with this brilliant, bright idea to treat psychopaths.
Mhm.
And it involved lots of LSD, or lysergic acid, as everyone knows, which is a hallucinogenic drug, and nudity, and locking psychopaths into padded rooms where they were being fed through tubes in the walls and put through a series of empathy building and trust building exercises in order to cure them of their psychopathy.
All right.
And lots of very famous, including like Peter Woodcock, lots of famous Canadian serial killers or child murderers were actually sent and treated in this program. And all of this, and basically the treatment involved getting them high on LSD and getting them to talk to each other. And this strange concept that the psychopaths would become each other's therapists,
Mhm.
and that they would talk to each other and teach each other how to be more empathetic people.
How successful was it?
So when they started the program, the recidivism rate or the reoffending rate of psychopaths who had been in prison was 60%. So meaning after they were released, 60% of all these psychopaths would commit a crime again. Someone did a study apparently in the 90s, according to Jon Ronson, that looked at all of the people that were kept in the Oak Ridge Center, and 80% of them committed crimes again after being released. Peter Woodcock committed a crime before he even left because he was given if I recall, an 3-hour pass to go out of the hospital.
Yeah,
And he murdered one of his fellow patients
I see.
during that time. So he didn't even wait to be released before he reoffended. He took a hatchet apparently to the guy. So not only was it not successful in treating them, it actually apparently made them worse somehow. And some of the psychopaths supposedly stated that, if anything, the program made them better psychopaths because all that teaching them how to be empathetic or teaching them how to be kinder simply made them better at pretending to be empathetic
Yeah, true.
and becoming better manipulators, because apparently that's what psychopaths are known to do, is to manipulate people emotionally to get what they want.
Not to mention that a lot of people who were put in that concentration camp, they were not even psychopaths.
Some
Not
of them,
like
some of them might not have been. Yes,
Yeah,
this was
like
1960s.
before this podcast, actually, I watched a video interviewing one of the people who were in the camp. I use the word camp here. Just use your imagination. So he said that he wasn't even a psychopath. He was abused by his mother, but then it's just like his anger just like accelerated somehow, and he got into the Oak Ridge, and later on when he was released, he committed a crime again.
Yeah, something that I knew about outside of this book, but it was also about the Oak Ridge Center for treatment, and like one of the most horrifying ideas that they had as well was they had women who were committed to the Oak Ridge Center some of them who were victims of sexual abuse or similarly, being counseled by fellow patients, some of whom were men who had themselves committed sexual offenses.
Wow.
And somehow the doctors involved there thought that would be a good idea to have like female victims of sexual assault to be talked to and be exposed to men who had committed sexual assault. the whole thing was a disaster, really, and it's kind of a dirty word in psychiatric medicine now. It's called the Oak Ridge scandals for a good
But
reason
still,
now.
some people, some psychiatrists, and some people who study criminology here like that, they like John mentioned in the book, they believe that those psychopaths, they are incurable, right? And it's a very debatable topic if you go on Google to see whether you should cure and should lock them away or you should like give them a death sentence.
So yeah, you're right, because that's definitely become the mainstream view. In the 1960s, when Elliot Barker was doing this sort of thing, it wasn't the mainstream view yet. That's why he was trying to treat and cure psychopaths. But when Dr. Robert Hare comes in and makes his list, he is definitely of the opinion that psychopaths cannot be cured. And this has become the default assumption, that there is no point trying to cure psychopaths, and instead the focus should be about trying to detect psychopaths in the criminal justice system and locking them up for everyone else's safety. Really, they're not concerned about treatment because apparently there isn't one.
Mm. Actually, I have read a story about James Fallon. I don't know if you know him. He diagnosed himself. Like one day, he just like looked up on the CT images that he took with his patients, and then he found out, okay, there's a picture of a brain that showed that strongly suggested that this guy could be a psychopath, and he later found out that it was his brain, and he
Quite a shock, yes.
yeah, what a shock. And he went around, like he asked his family members, his friends, do you think I'm a psychopath? And they said definitely. And from that moment, the moment that he knew he was a psychopath, right? He decided to set some boundaries. He decided to take notes on his, let's say, daily life, and he doesn't commit any crime. There's a story about this guy as well. He wrote a book about it. So, if we try to look for some examples of whether psychopath is curable or not, I think the answer it could be yes, right? Not I think just now the topic is that the difference between psychopath and sociopath. Some people they say psychopath is you're born a psychopath. Sociopath is more like it's because of the society around you. For James, in this situation, I think it's more towards sociopath, and he knows that okay, he's aware that he's a psychopath or sociopath, and then he decides to become better, to not commit any crime. People around him help him as well. So yeah, I feel like the book and the people, the psychopaths, it's very hopeless to me, honestly. But somewhat, if we look at different ways, like maybe there are people out there that are trying to cure them. They have the reason to do that.
Yeah, it is. It does present a very bleak view. The idea that if you're a psychopath, there is nothing to be done about it. It again, it should be pointed out there is that the label of psychopath is somewhat complicated as well, because again, it's not actually a recognized diagnosis in the field of mental health care. There is no psychiatric association, nor is there any mental health association that would give you officially the diagnosis of psychopathy. It doesn't exist in so there's the DSM-5, which we talked about before, but it's the manual of mental illness. Jon Ronson actually talks about it. He mentions it in the beginning of his TED Talk. But it is essentially a list and descriptions of all of the different possible mental illnesses that you can be diagnosed with. It covers everything from depression, bipolar. It covers the personality disorders like borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder. And it has something it calls antisocial personality disorder, which sometimes is conflated with psychopathy, but isn't really the same thing. ASD is a little bit more broader and actually includes what most people would call sociopathy.
So where is psychopathy classified under?
So it's not classified under the DSM. It is, however, used essentially in the criminal justice system and in criminal psychology or forensic psychology to describe a particular pattern of behavior in violent criminals. And so it's not something you can be diagnosed with from a psychiatrist in a healthcare setting. In fact, looking it up, it was in fact Dr. Robert Hare who kind of repopularized the term psychopathy when he created his list. The term psychopathy is quite old. It has existed for a very long time, but it kind of described different things over the period. Robert Hare was the one who sort of even if he didn't create it, he definitely popularized this concept that psychopathy is an inherent difference in the brain that leads to certain individuals in society to be more likely to commit violent crimes for pleasure or for thrills and such. This is his contention, at least. Again, this is not something that exists in the DSM. Some psychiatrists or psychologists have maybe said that perhaps psychopathy should be simply considered a subcategory of antisocial personality disorder. Dr. Robert Hare disagrees with this. He says that antisocial personality disorder is much broader than his definition for psychopathy, and he believes that psychopathy is in fact unique, even though they both share similar traits: lower empathy, more likely to commit crimes, impulsive behavior. He does not believe that they're the same thing. Or at least he believes that psychopaths is a more narrower definition than ASD is. So there's a lot of debate going on, and lots of academics are still arguing back and forth over this thing and where to draw the line and what is real, what isn't.
Wow, I could see that I'll get nailing this topic, guys. All right, so you said that he came up with a checklist, right? And
Yes,
I actually brought a checklist.
Yep.
There are 20 items on the checklist. The Hare psychopathy checklist revised, right? So let's talk about this. Have you read through them, and have you done any to detect whether you are a psychopath or not?
So I did do both. I looked up the list, and then before I looked up the list, I went online and found some quiz that supposedly made use of this to assess you, and I did take it, and I did get my results, which I'll talk about later in a bit. But
How is that conducted?
so, okay, this is a bit again a complicated thing, and this is something that Jon Ronson doesn't talk about in the book. Is that Jon Ronson kind of presents the idea that it's a 20-item list, and you go around talking to people, and
that's what I thought. Like, is that a yes/no question? Like, you take the yes and then no, and then yes/no.
It's a bit more complicated than that. So, in a simplified form, essentially, you've got 20 items. Each one is designed to assess some aspect of psychopathic behavior.
All right.
And you answer the questions on a 3-point rating system. So, no, it doesn't apply to you at all, which is rated at 0. I don't know, or it slightly relates to me, is rated at 1. And this applies to me is rated at 2. This means that the maximum score you can get on this test is 40.
Yeah, 2 multiplied by 20.
2 multiplied by 20. And the cutoff point, according to, I think, the British criminal psychologist, is 25.
25.
So if you're 25 and above, according to this list, you are a psychopath, or at least you demonstrate traits that are consistent with psychopathic behavior, and you may be a psychopath. Again, Jon Ronson portrays it as though it's just 20 questions that you kind of ask people about their life, and then you interpret it based on the questions.
True. It was fascinating, honestly, but then I think like it's not the correct way to conduct this, right?
No. So firstly there is a manual that comes with it. The manual is quite long. I think it's 200 or 400 pages thick. Yes.
A manual for like 20 items on the list.
For these 20 items, yes, there's a manual for it. You have to pay money for it, so I haven't been able to read it because you do have to pay for it. But you can look it up on the internet at places where you can. And there was a description where it's, according to the description, the process of interviewing someone using this list should take about 90 to 120 minutes. Wow. And then from the contents of the interview, it should take you about an hour, essentially, to kind of score each of these points. Also,
are there any sub-questions under those 20 items?
So, okay, so the way that as I understand it, roughly, is the way it should be done, according to Dr. Robert Hare, is that it's a combination of interviewing the subject, the patient, and also looking at things like their criminal history or their medical history, and then from there you you use the list essentially as a guide. So you interview them and you ask them about their early childhood, like, something like that. What did you do as a child? What did you do for fun? And said, oh, there wasn't, and they answer something like, oh, there wasn't very much to do in my house. I mostly played around in the neighborhood. Occasionally, I would throw stones at cats. And then you ask, oh, well, did you always throw stones at cats? Like, oh yeah, I did that pretty much every day when there was a cat in the backyard. I hated the cats; they were annoying. Oh, okay. What else did you do? Oh, I would sometimes shoot at birds with a slingshot. Oh, okay. Did you do anything else? And then from there you can build up. Oh, okay.
Yeah, so you extract from the questions that you ask them, right?
Yes, and you
not like
from
directly ask them. Oh, yeah. Do you feel any need of stimulation or promise report? You don't ask them.
You don't ask them directly that, because that's kind of, for one thing, that's kind of pointless, because it's either people don't understand the question or it's very easy for them to know what you're trying to get them to say and changing your answer. So really the process isn't as simple as just 20 items. He just simply considers these, so Dr. Hare basically considers the 20 items to be simply a guideline for what kind of behaviors to look out for in potential psychopaths.
I see. Wow. Yeah. The way that Jon writes in the book makes me feel like everyone around me is psychopath.
Yeah, it's very, he kind of misrepresents, I think. And Dr. Robert Hare, actually, he did write an open letter criticizing the book, saying that the way that Jon presented the way the test is used is absolutely inaccurate and is not how it should be done. It should also be pointed out that, according to Dr. Hare, this test only is applicable if used by a trained clinician or a psychiatrist, and should the results of it shouldn't be considered valid if it's done by just anybody. And I should point out as well that when I did the self-test, that's absolutely not a valid use of the test at all. It was just
how much did you score? How much did you score?
So my score, again, 25 is the cutoff point to be a psychopath.
Yeah.
My score was 9, which
so it's safe.
So I'm not a psychopath. Thankfully, right? I'm not a psychopath. Although apparently, according to the website, I was more psychopathic than 12% of the general population, which is
my god,
which is a weird. I'm not sure what that means, to be honest. Like.
Oh wow. Okay. Yeah.
But that's not much. 12%. So.
The thing is, like, when you look at this list, there are some of the very questionable items, such as impulsivity, right?
Yes.
And irresponsibility, and what can I feel like? There are some very general questions like you mentioned earlier. So I don't know how do they actually measure that, but I can understand why they have like 200 pages manual.
Yeah, it's complicated. There's no real way. I mean, how do you, like, item 1, glibness and superficial charm? How do you measure that? How do you sit down and go, yes, this person rates 7 on superficial charm or something? None of these things really are items that can be measured or have a score attached to them. So I can see why a long interview process is needed, and this is a lot more complicated than just simply saying, oh yes, you match with item 6, you match with item 11, you're not a psychopath, or you are a psychopath. It's not as simple as that. The book kind of does portray it like that, as though that, oh, if you get the wrong score, you're automatically a psychopath. But the way Jon Ronson presents the way you get that score maybe isn't representative of how the process should actually be done.
All right. I have 2 more questions before we come to an end of our podcast, right? So you said that you really like the journey that Jon explores this whole psychopathy, right? So in one word, after finishing the book, what is your thought on it? Like, afterthoughts kind of.
So my feelings on the book are complicated.
Right.
If I had to pick one word to describe how I feel about it, I'm fascinated by this subject.
So it's complicated, but you are fascinated by that.
It's interesting. It's, even if he's not being 100% clinically accurate or scientifically correct about what he's talking about, he does the way the different people that he speaks to, the strange characters, the David Schuller, the conspiracy theorists, or the Toto. What was, I can't remember what his name was. But the former Death Squad.
Oh, the Al one, huh?
No, Al. That would have been Al Dunlap was the CEO, and then you had Emmanuel Toto Constant, who was the Haitian Death Squad leader.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And these are interesting people. I mean, terrible people, I guess, depending. I think most people would consider them terrible people, but interesting. And Jon has a really great writing style. Like you somehow feel like he's basically just talking about his journey, interviewing a bunch of people.
It's just like the news, right?
Yeah.
It's just like the news when you mention someone that the audience might ask, like, "Oh, who is this guy?" And he goes on explaining, "Okay, yeah, this guy is what he do."
And he even puts in little snippets of stuff. Like for instance, when he interviews someone who was strapped down to the Canadian murderer Peter Woodcock, and then Jon writes, he asks him, "Who's Peter Woodcock?" And it says, "Look him up." And then it just cuts to a Wikipedia excerpt about who Peter Woodcock is, and it's an interesting style, and I quite like the way he presented it. It's maybe not 100% factual, at least according to Dr. Robert Hare, but it's certainly entertaining.
So, what do you dislike about the book aside from its scientific facts or psychological facts that maybe it's incorrect somewhat? Yeah. So, what do you dislike about the book?
That is the inaccuracy possibly is the main thing that I dislike about it. There isn't really much that I would dislike about the book, to be honest. Something that I found perhaps a little bit strange was Jon referring to himself as a trained psychopath spotter
Yeah.
after he had gone on this course and such. And I was never 100% certain if he was being sincere about it or if he was kind of joking that, oh yes, I can now spot psychopaths from a mile away using this list. Or whether I couldn't tell if he was being sincere or just kind of joking about the thing. So I kind of found that it wasn't necessarily a bad thing, nor did I dislike it, but it kind of took me out of the book for a while when I was trying to read into his attitude about it. Is he being sincere in saying he's a psychopath spotter? Is he not? Even his TED Talk kind of has that issue because he talks about being a psychopath spotter, but he also talks about it in a rather humorous way. So is he joking about being a psychopath spotter, or is he being serious about it? Or is he being serious and joking about the subject? I don't know. Yeah. And he seems to be quite ambiguous about that. I don't think it was a bad element to the book, but it was sort of distracting to me reading through it. It felt like the one thing because again, it was a really good book and I really couldn't stop flipping through it. Yeah. But when I get to that point, and every time it gets to the moments of his psychopath spotting moments, it kind of took me out of it.
Yeah, but it's thought-provoking in a way, the way that it kind of relates a lot of themes in our daily life, like from individual psychopaths to social, psychology, and then anthropology. I mispronounced this word, but never mind. Yeah, okay. That was a wonderful conversation with you. Thank you very much, Ming.
Thank you.
And I hope that I could see you in other episodes down the line. And thank you very much to the audience for watching this episode. We'll see you next time. Bye.